Hello there, everyone. Hope you all are having a great day. It's me, back again with another video. This time not at 12 o'clock at night. Just me chilling here with my white papaya tea, It'd be like that sometimes. Today, we're going to be talking about something that's kind of odd for this channel, considering this channel was originally a gaming channel, which is we're going to be talking about The Social Contract by Rousseau. Let me grab my copy of it. This book. I know, books. Kind of scary to imagine an illiterate person giving you a book review. So the big focus of The Social Contract by Rousseau is on the idea of, can there be any legitimate or sure form of government? So that's kind of the theme of the book as a whole, but I want to focus on specifically what he has to say about individuals in society. And I think that is something that can be drawn away no matter if you are or are not interested in politics. So let's jump into that. So a little background on the context of this book. It was started in 1743, but it was never completed. It actually was intended to have more to it, but Rousseau never finished it. Rousseau himself is kind of he's not really an aristocrat. He's a servant, but he kind of traces his lineage back to someone who was kind of in an aristocratic standing. So he has this I kind of have a bit of say in the social order of this time period, but really he does not. He is a servant, so he is not someone who is extremely up there in the social hierarchy. As I said, we're going to be focusing on a lot of what he has to say about the individual. Rousseau really focuses on three entities, in my opinion. He focuses on government, he focuses on society, and he focuses on the individual. So what Rousseau believes is that the social contract is a binding pact between individuals that creates the government. So essentially it creates society and government, so individuals are kind of like the basis. So we're going to focus on three specific things that Rousseau has to say about individuals. We're going to focus on voting, we're going to focus on war, and we're going to focus on freedom. So to start off with voting, which is something I think is very pertinent, especially considering we are in 2020. So for those of you who are my American watchers, you know that this is an election cycle, as we've been reminded many times through many wonderful debates. And it's quite a big deal this year. So if you are of age to vote, which is 18 or up, you should vote. But it's interesting because Rousseau believes in his work that the very right to vote imposes a duty on people to instruct themselves on politics. So he believes the fact that you have a right to vote means that you should be informed on what you're voting about, which I think is very interesting because it kind of leads into his next big point about voting, which is that the people, which is society as a whole, he believes is never wrong, but he believes it is often misled. I think this is especially pertinent in our society, which is one that is now full of discussions of fake news, of certain news sources being right, certain ones not being, and also just an end of, I feel like a lot of people have been very misled on issues. I think of things like Brexit, where there was a lot of people that kind of had buyer's remorse after Brexit, or other things in that realm that people seem to regret in retrospect because they weren't informed enough on them at the start. One of the most interesting things, though, that he says about voting is this quote. I want to read it verbatim, or as verbatim as I can get it, where he says, when voting, the question asked should be, is it advantageous to the state? Not, is it advantageous to this man or to that party that such proposal be adopted? I think this is really cool because we live in a society right now very much where I feel like people mainly vote based on their own personal desires for what government should be doing. I can say on a personal level that it's not often that I think, am I voting in a way that is advantageous to the state? But I think in a lot of ways, we vote in a way that is advantageous to ourselves as human beings, and that lines up with our morality and what we believe in, as compared to considering what is best for the whole. So regardless of where you land on the political spectrum or what you believe about politics, I think it is important to consider this question, is how you are voting advantageous for society as a whole, or are you voting the way you are because it's advantageous to you? Moving beyond that, another topic he discusses that I think he has a lot of very interesting insights on is war. So he talks about how he believes men are not naturally enemies, that at its core, war is not a conflict between men, but between states. But there really is very little distinction in our mind these days, I think, of what makes a difference between war and personal relations. I can think of a lot of the stuff that went on between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, where they exchanged insults on Twitter, where that is the weirdest sentence, but where people kind of throw back personal insults, and that kind of is the basis for what causes wars or what causes conflict. And Rousseau says that is not what a conflict is, though. He claims, along with this, then, that declarations of war are warnings to the subjects. So declarations of war are not like, hey, you right there, yeah, we're coming for you. But it's more or less like warning the people of what's going on. And one of the most interesting things he has, because this was written in the 1700s, is that he reflects a piece of the Geneva Conventions, which is that war gives no right to inflict more destruction than is necessary. So essentially, the concept that you don't just inflict destruction to inflict destruction, that you should be targeted in how you do it, that it should have an end purpose. Now, what I'm assuming is going to take up the bulk of this video is his third point, which is about freedom. And I think that this is one of the fundamentally most interesting things that he has to talk about. Personally, I come from a Presbyterian Christian background, so there's a lot of discussion of free agency and free will and predestination, which if you don't know what free will versus predestination is, or that argument, essentially the argument is whether or not people are able to make their own choices or whether we are predetermined in the choices we will make. And I like Rousseau's argument. So he firstly claims, because one of the big points that he emphasizes is that laws in themselves do not remove men's freedom, but actually give them more freedom. He claims that only through living in civil society can a man experience their fullest freedom. And I love his definition of what freedom is, because he kind of defines it as it's less in doing one's own will than in not being subject to that of another, which is a very interesting definition of freedom, because that's a definition of what freedom is the lack of, not what freedom really is. And again, he reiterates it later on, to be free is not to be left to do what you want to do, but to be enabled to do what you ought to do. So Rousseau believes freedom isn't something that is like, oh, I'm free to go out to the supermarket today, but that you're free to do what you should be doing. This also is interesting in terms of laws, because under this argument, he could say that you're free even though we tell you that you can't go out and steal things, because we're enabling you to do what you ought to do. Laws are in place not to restrict personal freedom, but to make it so that your freedom is properly expressed, that you are free to do what you ought to be doing. Rousseau also makes a very interesting and strong argument against predestination, where he talks about if you take away all freedom of the will, essentially your actions don't have any moral consequence. So if we're all determining what we're going to do, whatever you choose to do has no moral significance. He also, however, argues on the other side of things, in a thing that I think is kind of an argument against free will, that to be governed by appetite is essentially slavery, where he says that if you are governed by your desire to go eat or your desire to go do this or that, that essentially you're not free really, you're just governed by your biological, natural desires, which I think is a pretty strong pushback again against kind of the concept of freedom of will as well. So Rousseau kind of lands in this middle ground of what I like to call free agency, which is something that I personally hold, which is that we are doing what we want to do, but at the same time, we're not really free in how we're doing it. It's a really weird nuanced position. I'm not going to go into it here. It's also interesting because he talks about how in society, whenever you consent, for example, to society's rules about stealing, that essentially you are like, hey, in order to avoid becoming the victim of being stolen from, I'm okay that if I become a thief, that I get punished for it. So essentially, all men are bound by laws in equal portions. So a thief, whether it is you, me, someone else, it doesn't really matter. We're all going to be punished the same way. He also argues that any law that comes from the general will, which is people together deciding on something, is specifically a law that is not inhibiting freedom, but instead is a law which just registers what the people want. So whenever something comes up to vote in like your local elections or a national law is changed and we're asked for our opinions on it, essentially the question being asked is not, hey, do you like this law? But is the general will, is the majority of people okay with this law? Does this register with what they already believe? And Rousseau also goes even so far as to claim that if he does not vote the way that the general will does, that he must be mistaken in how he was voting. The last really interesting thing he touches on, kind of in the realm of freedom, is this idea of equality, which has been a big discussion, I know, for politics in 2020. And he talks about how equality is about the fact that, among other things, that no one is so poor that they have to sell themselves to someone else. This is, again, a very different time period, but I think it is interesting to consider that and to kind of dwell on that. Because as I was reading it, I kind of was struggling with this concept, do we live in a society that has equality? Because, people aren't really selling themselves. But at the same time, it sometimes feels like with how little people get paid, they kind of are selling themselves. Working a minimum wage job is not sustainable. It's something you don't have enough money to sustain yourself generally off a basic minimum wage job. So are we living in an equal society, or does that mean that our society is not equal under Rousseau's definition? Overall, I just think Rousseau has a lot of very interesting things to say. Again, this is just kind of touching on his concepts about individuals. I didn't even get into his concepts about government, about society, about lawgivers. There's so much other stuff that he has. So if you enjoyed this review and you felt like, hey, I'd like to hear about government, which I would love because I'm a poli-sci major, so talking about government is my happy place, then please subscribe or drop a like. There'll be more videos like this out in the future with just various book reviews. So thank you so much for spending a couple minutes out of your day with me, and catch them waves, am I right, boys?